Daisy.
And I'm Terry.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 248.
And this week, it's Daisy's turn to share something with us. Daisy, what do you have?
Gas.
Besides gas.
Well, Terry, I am back with another Jim Kwik episode. When I was looking for one the other day, actually, I made a note of a couple of different episodes, but this is, I think, the current one. It was at least the current one when I had a look, and it just caught my eye. It's another one where the title's different on YouTube, and I did actually listen to the YouTube one this time. It was almost twice as long.
Wow.
Normally, they're only a little bit longer, but yeah, this one obviously had quite a bit more content. But the title on the podcast is Neuroscience Behind Online Hostility and Social Behavior with Dr. Ben Raine. And on YouTube, it's called How to Overcome Your Social Media Addiction. It's probably quite telling how they changed the titles for YouTube. Dr. Raine, taken this from the bio on Jim's description, has completed groundbreaking research on the neurobiology of social behavior. His insights have gained him recognition from some of the top institutions around the world, and he is on this episode to shed some light on why it's easier for people to behave negatively online. So I think you can see straight away why it caught my eye. It's something that we mention quite a lot, that balance of social media, good things on one side and not so good things on the other. But he kicks off by asking Dr. Raine for 3 tips for brain health. And I think this might have been one of the little extra YouTube things. It sounds like it's something that he asks his guests every week, and I haven't heard it before. So this feels like some extra YouTube content. They're all things we've heard before. The first one is sleep, but he talks a little bit about his own routine. He says he always aims for 8 hours of sleep. That's the amount of time that he's found that he does best on, with all the usual sleep hygiene rules to get the best quality sleep possible. And he says that he has a really strict regime for that. And he says that he can really notice the difference when he gets less sleep or less quality sleep. Exercise is the second one, and he talks a little bit about how it's linked to neurogenesis, so, creating new brain cells. And again, he says he really feels the difference on the days where he hasn't been able to do his usual exercise routine for one reason or another. And his general tip is just try to level up on whatever you do now. So, if you do nothing, go walking for 10 minutes. If you walk for 10 minutes, walk for 15. That kind of thing. He's not talking about going from one extreme to another. And his last one is connection, social connection. We all know this now, or anyone who listens to these podcasts certainly does. Stats show that people are more isolated than ever. So connection is more important than ever to focus on. Hence why a lot of these podcasts are starting to focus on talking about this. Our brains reward us for connection and punish us for isolation. And they talk a little bit about how mood in particular is impacted. And of course, that rolls nicely into what he talks about. And so Jim asks him, how does social media fit into this need for connection? Because this is where Dr. Raine has done quite a lot of research. He seems to be a similar age to us and remembers the analog age. This is Jim. But he says, which I thought was quite an interesting question, is there a difference in brain development for people who are growing up now in this, very different technological, sometimes there are those words you trip up over, one of those ages to the age that we grew up. Our developmental years were very different to those of kids now. My niece and nephews are growing up in a very different environment when it comes to technology. He says the research isn't there yet, but questions are definitely arising about things that might impact brain development. There are so many digital tools at the disposal of young people now. He says there's a fair bit of discussion around attention development, but it is quite isolating. It takes up a lot of time and space in our day. Dr. Rain talks about how when he was younger, his friends used to come around and they used to play PlayStation together, but they would be playing it together, sitting next to each other on the sofa, chatting at the same time. So they had that social interaction, even though they were doing something virtual. But now it's much more likely to be disconnected from that physical interaction. Kids are more likely to FaceTime or text rather than hanging out together after school. They're playing those games on their own in their bedrooms. They might be connected to their friends, but they're connected virtually through, text chat or playing the games together or whatever. But they're not sitting next to each other on the sofa as much. So there's less face-to-face contact. So it's probably going to be important from a developmental point of view and is likely to have an impact on the development of social behaviours. As an aside, this is my aside, I'm not sure, I'm sure this is true overall, but certainly my teenage neighbour upstairs hangs around with her mates a lot in real life because they tend to hang around outside the window where I'm trying to work, playing their music and chatting very loudly. So I think people are still hanging out in real time, but yes, they are probably doing it a lot less. But I mean, when I think back to the amount of time I spent on the phone, I'm not sure how different that is to spending time chatting on FaceTime. Less so, really, because you can't see. But when you're replacing the actual face-to-face with interacting via social media or whatever is what he's talking about. So I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there. But Dr. Rain has recently released a paper with one of his students about social media and empathy, which sounds quite interesting. And Jim asked him to share some of the findings and explain a bit about what is happening to our brain when we consume social media. Why do we tend to feel less inhibited online and are more likely to be a bit mean, frankly? And he said that there were some studies done back in the 80s, in the early days of computers, where they looked at people interacting in a virtual space and how they tended to become more disinhibited and they would start swearing at each other, being nasty to each other. And fast forward to today's environment and social media, he says there are always going to be people who disagree with something that you post about, but some do it really quite passionately and they want you to know about it. And some of those comments do tend to be pretty hostile. Instead of saying, hey, I disagree with what you're saying and here's why, it's more along the lines of, I hate you and what you represent. And the more popular a post is, the more of this attention it seems to get, and they chatted a bit about how they'd both experienced that. He says there are many factors at play here, and obviously one of those is the safety of your physical environment. How many people would say the things they say online if that person was standing right in front of them? Not very many, I suspect. But what about empathy? He says that something is going on with the empathy circuitry in our brain, and he calls this the virtual disengagement hypothesis. This is what his paper's about. He says that in virtual environments, the brain areas that regulate empathy theoretically disengage. Empathy is taking on or sharing someone else's emotions and feelings, and we tend to arrive at empathy by detecting and noticing other people's social cues. Sounds, he mentions some studies where people have played different, quite emotive noises. But sounds, facial expressions, body language, they're very important for us to trigger empathy. But when we interact online, especially in text-based expressions, we're not seeing and hearing and processing the same things. It all gets stripped back to the text on the screen. The person is removed and is replaced by just a name or a handle of some kind or an avatar. So because these empathy circuits don't engage in the same way, we're less likely to put ourselves in the perspective of what the other person's feeling. And another aside from me, this reminded me, goes back to the episode I did about vision boards. Sorry, I was trying to remember the episode, but it goes back to what I was saying in that episode about what they were talking about, how it's a different pathway in our brain when we're looking at images versus when we're looking at text. So basically, we're less likely to care about the people around us who are online, and so we're more inclined towards hostility. If you hurt someone online, you don't have to take part by witnessing their pain. Another aside, this is why I used to encourage people in Facebook groups to actually express those hurt feelings a bit more, to try and engage people's empathy. So, instead of getting into that offensive, defensive, back and forth, actually say, hold on a minute, that really hurt my feelings. Because that, unless someone really is just being a bit of an asshole, if they're confronted by you saying, even if it is just text, wow, I found that really hurtful, there aren't many people who are just going to keep carrying on unless they really are just being a troll. And I did wonder, this is another aside, I wondered if something similar but different is going on with road rage, at least partly. I'm a little bit, I have to say sometimes I'm a little bit aggressive with my gestures in the car when I get frustrated. But there is that boundary. I would be less likely to do it if I was walking past that person without that protective barrier of the vehicle between them and me. So I think, anything that gives you that physical protection, like he mentioned, the safety of your environment. And it reminded me, I don't know if you've ever seen this video of it's two dogs one either side of a glass door, and they are really going at each other, properly going at each other. And somebody opens the door and they're like, oh, hi, everything fine? They shut the door again and they're like, argh. So there is some kind of safety, isn't there, in having a barrier of some kind. But going back to what he was saying, he's saying it's this slight distance, this disengagement is you kind of feel emotionally free. But unfortunately, the recipient of that still feels it full force. So you may disconnect as the giver empathetically, but not as the receiver of that hostility online. So we might feel that disconnect when we're giving it out, but unfortunately the person that's receiving it feels it almost the same as if you were standing right in front of them. And in some ways it's worse because they can't see, they're not getting that feedback. And of course that doesn't stop people bullying face to face, but you get what he's saying here. We're much more likely, and I think we've probably all been guilty of saying things that we're tapping away on our keyboard that we wouldn't say if we were having an actual conversation with somebody in the same room. Jim goes on to ask him, what makes social media so addictive and how does it impact our cognitive health? And Dr. Rain says it is starting to be recognised under the same umbrella as gaming use disorders. There are some parallels there. He says there's no diagnostic criteria at the moment, but it's kind of started to be thought of under that same umbrella. There's evidence that people who use social media so much that it interferes with your normal life, that one of those diagnostic criteria, aka addicted to social media, people who are using it to that level show similar brain changes to those with drug addiction. And the biggest part of that is a reduced volume, literally, of the prefrontal cortical areas. And this part of your brain is the executive director of the brain, if you like, and it can help suppress emotions, it can help control emotional reactions, and it tends to be a direct, thoughtful action. You talk about it, don't you? The different parts of your brain, when you've got that part of your brain that's screaming for this, that, and the other, and you want to engage this part of your brain that thinks more, that thinks through the actions. When this is reduced in volume, this part of the brain, the urges become more difficult to suppress. I think most people listening to this, I certainly have experienced this. But these same brain changes are seen in social media addiction. And as we've said before, and he says, there are lots of great things about social media. Social media connects us, but it also, unfortunately, separates us. The social nature of social media is very real. We are seeing social information, but we may not be engaging with each other in a way that is authentic. The human brain cares a lot about social information, and so there is a high reward value for consuming these things. We all know about how we can be negatively impacted by social media. Jim asks Dr. Rain about, are there some signs to look out for that your brain is being negatively impacted by social media, and how can we maybe counteract some of these effects? And he mentions digital social media dopamine detox. He says these are all sort of buzzwords that people talk about. He says that there is definite evidence that taking time off social media does reap benefits, improvement in mood, improvement in sleep. But he says, just start by being mindful about whether you're using social media in ways that are unhealthy. Is it getting in the way of your life? And maybe restricting it might be helpful for some people. Some of the things are a bit more doable. You could limit screen time and exposure to certain apps, maybe by selecting certain times of the day or a maximum time, whatever. But start by being aware of how much you're using social media. And he recommends, and I thought this was a really good idea, is turning on a timer when you start and see how much time you're actually spending, rather than the time that you think you're spending. He says time distortion is very common. You might think, all right, I've just spent 10 minutes, but if you had a timer going, it might actually show you that you spent half an hour. Now, that's not going to happen if you've got, 10 minutes spare between meetings, but, I thought that was quite a good idea. And they talk about algorithms. We've mentioned algorithms before, that are designed to funnel you down pathways. And it did actually remind me, as an aside, about remembering something that, and I can't remember the author's name, but in the book Everyday Sexism, and she talks about the algorithms at play on YouTube and how they funnel you down various pathways, that they do with showing you, when you've watched something, they'll show you videos that you might be interested in. If you've got autoplay selected, they'll just start playing them. And I tested this for myself, and it was actually quite scary when, you put in something like feminism, for example, how quickly she was talking about the kind of exposure that young men in particular have to certain ways of thinking, how quickly they can be funneled down pathways that show these kind of videos. And I did actually test that, and was a little bit disheartened with how very quickly we start seeing videos from people. I won't mention names, but try it for yourself and you'll see. A lot of content on social media is designed to capture your attention. They talk about how difficult it is to look away from a car wreck. You don't want to look, but it's really difficult to stop yourself doing that. And he says, there's a reason for that. Your brain, from an evolutionary standpoint, wants you to pay attention to things like that because it could save your life in the future. And that's not the case so much now, but it's just something that we're hardwired to do. So we're naturally drawn to aggression and violence and those kind of images that come up. And the algorithm is designed to grab and keep your attention. And I think I mentioned in an episode recently how one of the local news channels was doing that. A local sort of newspaper channel was just starting to put these images from all around the country of car wrecks and people getting stabbed and all these things. And yes, I would be interested to know about something like that had happened locally. It's of local interest along with all the other things. But you don't need to keep feeding me everything that's happening somewhere else in the country. Thank you very much. But it does grab your attention. So be aware of what's popping up on your feed. And again, we've talked about this because you can change it mindfully and you can harness it and guide it in a way that's more productive. I've done that. That's why I see, cute puppy videos and art videos and different things coming up on my feed because I purposefully manage it that way. And just quickly, he does offer a warning with things that you're seeing. He says, please, he says, just validate your information. Don't just take something on face value, especially something that's grabbing your attention. It can be a bit trickier with more complicated science information. That often means going back to the original scientific papers. And he mentioned that there's a lot of development with AI summaries, which he was saying, he hopes that continues. So actually, it will be a lot easier to just see a summary of that and make it a bit easier to digest. But ask yourself how much you can trust the person providing you with this information, and maybe go and check them out and find out a bit more about what their sources are. Are they qualified to be talking to you about the thing that you're trusting them on? Because it's very easy to forget where you learned something and then you just pass that on in conversation, but we tend to sort of pass it on as fact. So it is quite important to just verify some of those things. And that's about it. That's what they were talking about. But I thought we talk about the potential perils of social media, but I thought you'd be quite interested, especially about what he was talking about, the empathy circuits in the brain. I'd quite like to find out a bit more about the paper that he did. Sounds quite interesting. But, social media is not going away. So I think it is very important that people are doing these studies and finding out what's going on. And if there are some real problems coming out of that, how we can adapt and not harm ourselves too much in the process.
You gave an example of kind of curating what you see come up in your feed. And I was just talking with someone that I do some coaching with about this the other day, and she was describing, now I know based on everything we've ever talked about, I know the behavior itself is a problem, but let's look past that a moment, that she wakes up in the middle of the night and she'll get up her phone and start reading things. Now I know all kinds of things about blue light and not activating that in our eyes at night. And she's aware of that as well. But this is her strategy at this moment. But what she finds is then she starts reading the news and reading about things that are concerning to her. And then she feels anxious. And then she's lying awake in a state of dread, about things that are going on in the world and whatnot. And so without trying to correct the behavior of even grabbing the phone, I encouraged, what about if you changed what you looked at during that time? She's like, well, what do you mean? What option do I have? And I said, well, for example, when I pick up my phone randomly and look for things, I'm looking at skiing videos. I'm looking at ski clothing and gear sales. I don't buy it, but I like to look and I like to think about it. And it really hadn't dawned on her that she didn't have to go down this old pathway that she had been going down about this is what I would look at. And that you can start to curate. Now, I'm sure I get a lot more videos in my feed than you do that are skiing related because I've been looking at so many. You and I both get puppy ones and kitten ones because that's what we look at. And so really paying attention to, again, curating who you're reading, what kind of content you're looking at and thinking about to keep yourself in that better space.
Yeah, and Facebook in particular does give you that option when I don't know, I tend to mostly look at mine on the computer through a browser, which I know works in a slightly different way. That's one of the reasons why I don't use it via the app, because it drives me nuts. But on the post, there's that option you've got the little cross in the corner that you can tick the option of stop seeing so many videos like this. So it even gives you that direct action. You don't have to sort of trick the algorithm, as it were, by going to look for things that you want it to show you more of. You can actively unclick things that you don't want to see so much of. So yeah, when that local newspaper that I followed started showing those videos, because it didn't always, it's just some kind of new thing. Yeah, every time those come up, I click in the corner, stop seeing so many videos like that. And yeah, they've all but disappeared from the feed. And or I don't click on them when they do show up. But taking that extra step of getting rid of that post seems to cut them down even more. So there are ways of doing it. And I think I've said before, especially with something like that, with something where you're scrolling, because you don't know what's going to come up next. So it's a bit different from when you're doing research on something. You're actively looking for certain things, certain topics. You're putting it into Google or whatever. Then it's giving you some options. When you're scrolling down on social media, you'll just be bombarded by image after image, and without any warning. And that's what started happening. I don't want to see some of these images. So yeah, that's where I think it's important, where you're potentially going to be surprised by things that are going to trigger you in some way.
I do think, as you said, some of it is actively curating and some is it weeds itself out because you don't look at them. I used to get hundreds of posts about desserts. Very rarely do I see a post about desserts anymore because I don't open them, don't spend any time on them. I don't search for them.
Yeah, it's the last thing you want to see come up when you're in the middle of a fast and quitting sugar.
That's right. That's right. So I like that you took that step of pursuing this quick brain episode and went deeper with it. I appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, just thinking of other things. But yes, I have done it in the past. It's quite difficult to do because I tend to flip back and forth, when I'm waiting for something to process on the editing. And, I'll just have a quick look at Facebook. But of course, you end up staying there for 5 or 10 minutes when you really only had a minute. So things like that, I think I did for a period of time. I kind of set a time when I checked into social media, and that was the only time of the day that I did it. I could do with being a bit more regimented like that. So that's definitely something that I might try. I'm not too bad. I certainly don't feel like it's taking over my life. I'm not obsessed. It's sort of just when I'm at the computer, it's a little bit too easy to flick back and forth. And that's something that I need to address. But I don't feel drawn to it. I'm not one of these people who's looking at it on my phone all the time because my phone's so small and it's too tiny and the apps drive me nuts and things. So I only use my phone as a phone and a walking audiobook. I don't use it for all these other things. So it's only when I'm actually sat in front of the computer anyway. So I do restrict a bit more than the average person probably just by virtue of not using my phone.
I have been making a very conscious effort, more so in the past couple of months, of not looking at my phone. Not just social media, but not looking at emails, work messaging, or whatever when I first wake up. Because I used to pick it up, start looking, and get lost. And so now I will purposely start my morning, get going, before I pick up the phone and start to open anything.
Yeah.
And it does, I wouldn't say there's huge, remarkable differences in my life, but I definitely feel different as I get my day started, that I'm not already in a place of distraction.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's much better just to start off your day just in a calmer, non sort of techie way. Even if there isn't anything sort of nasty lurking in your email box that would have set you off on a worse day had you read it versus not reading it. Just not starting your brain ticking over on work things or whatever it is until you sit down with that purpose. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Good. Okay. Well, until we see each other again next time, I hope you have a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everyone.